Russia, China, and India are dismantling and crushing liberal globalism. We're watching perhaps the single most momentous political world event since the fall of the Soviet Union. We're going to take a look at precisely what's happening, how Russia, China, and India are joining forces to crush the liberal globalist order, and how, in the most amazing irony of ironies, it was Bumblin Biden sanctions that ultimately did it. You are not going to want to miss this. Greetings, everyone. Dr. Steve here with you. I'm your daily fake news antidote. So come on into your Patriot Professor's Den, where I help you to think better so you can feel better in these crazy and turbulent times. So make sure to smack that bell and subscribe button. Also, before we begin, make sure to click on that link below and support this channel by visiting our awesome merch store that has all kinds of t-shirts and swag for you and the Patriots in your life. We've got our awesome line of Let's Go Brandon t-shirts, as well as our brand new Freedom Trucker shirts, our rhino hunting shirts, you name it. I got my Please Don't Feed the Animals or Don't Feed the Rhinos on this one. The most common feedback you're going to get is just these random people coming up to you and telling you how awesome your shirts are when you wear them out in public. It's such a great way to spread Patriot hope as well as support this channel. So make sure to click on that link below or go to store.turleytalks.com. That is store.turleytalks.com. Cannot thank you enough for your support. All right, let's dive right in here, gang. You know, the more I read about how Russia's responding to Western sanctions by completely upending the entire liberal globalist world order, I can't help but think of that scene in Star Wars when Obi-Wan is fighting Darth Vader, you know, when he says, "You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you could possibly imagine." You know, that scene comes to mind. The Western powers thought they were striking Russia down, and yet we're seeing Russia rise up, perhaps even more powerful than ever. But I think a better scene, something more analogous to what's actually happening here, is from the movie Die Hard. One of my favorite Christmas movies. Yes, Die Hard is an awesome Christmas movie. And if you don't know, there's a scene when the FBI cuts all electrical power to Nagatomi Plaza, where the evil villain Hans Gruber and his henchmen are holding all these people hostage. And in cutting the power, the FBI inadvertently disabled the vault lock, which opened up the massive safe that contained hundreds of millions of dollars that Hans Gruber came there to steal. Hans knew that the vault had several locks that they had to disconnect, but the final lock was connected to the downtown LA power grid. And so when the FBI showed up, Hans knew that standard operating procedure when dealing with hostage situations is you cut off the power. And that would disable all the locks. And he knew that this action taken by the FBI when it inadvertently disabled the lock, opened up the vault, which is exactly what happened. It's a great scene. You've got Beethoven's Ode to Joy playing in the background. The vault opens with heavenly light. It's so good. Great movie making. But I gotta say, it's becoming increasingly clear that Western powers, particularly the United States government headed by Bumblin Biden, as well as the EU, they're playing the part of the FBI. They're following through with the textbook geopolitical response to a nation acting in a way that the powers that be in DC and Brussels don't like. But what they didn't realize is that it appears that this is precisely what Russia wanted them to do. Russia appears to have wanted these Western sanctions to inflict the most severe economic sanctions possible to literally max out their ability to weaponize the global economy against Russia so as to actually enable Russia to once and for all emancipate itself from the Western globalist system. And together with China and India, lay the foundations for a new post-globalist, post-secular world. Now, we've been talking like this for the last couple of weeks, that what Russia is doing here has been in the works now for upwards of the last 15 years. But I was particularly struck by an article written by weapons analyst Scott Ritter, who argued this very thing. It's an article entitled "The Great Decoupling: How Western Sanctions Are Pushing Moscow East." And listen to the summary of the article. Quote, "By seeking an economic divorce from Russia, U.S. President Joe Biden and his European allies ignored the time-tested saying, 'Keep your friends close, but your enemies closer.' In doing so, they've enabled the complete economic decoupling of Russia from the West, the resulting Russian economic union with China will transform global geopolitical reality to the detriment of those who sought these sanctions in the first place. In other words, the only ones who are ultimately hurt by these sanctions are the very ones who are imposing them. I'll say that again because I think it's so essential to get what's really going on here, right? And go beyond the whole neocon hysterics coming from the likes of Sean Hannity and Lindsey Graham. By the way, isn't it stunning that just one event like this Ukraine crisis, just one event was enough to transform Trump's Patriot Republican Party, Trump's MAGA America First Republican Party, right back into the neocon travesty of Bush, Cheney, McCain, and Romney? It's astonishing. One event. I'm beginning to believe that the Republican Party, at least at the federal level, is beyond any hope. They are neocons through and through. But then again, what's so important to get here is that ultimately the only ones hurt by these sanctions are the very ones who are imposing them. These sanctions are sanctions against the working class, the middle class. They're imposing record inflation, stagflation, record fuel prices that end up only hurting us, not Russia. As I understand it, Russia's fuel prices are significantly lower than ours, as I understand it, again. Now, of course, things are going to be rough in Russia because of these sanctions, no question. But already, we're seeing the Russian ruble largely recover from its plunge a couple of weeks back, as well as the Russian markets, which have just recently opened up. Instead, what we're really seeing here, as Scott Ritter argues, is something that Putin has been preparing to do for some time now, since at least 2014 and the sanctions that were originally levied on Russia as punishment for their annexing Crimea. Ritter argues that it was right around that time that Putin and Russian officials agreed that the time to emancipate themselves from the U.S. and the EU-dominated international order had come. They would need to decouple themselves, literally divorce themselves from any and all Western financial ties so as to be, in effect, sanction-proof so that they could enact a geopolitics for the benefit of Russia and the larger Russosphere, transforming Russia effectively into what Putin himself called a civilization state, which we've been talking quite a bit about over the last couple of weeks. Now, what's so interesting here is that Ritter points out that the oligarchs and Russia's middle class make a lot of money off the West. So were Putin to do this himself, wean Russia away from Western globalism, that could upset both the middle class and the oligarchs, which could constitute a major challenge to Putin's power. However, and this is what makes me think of Hans Gruber, if the U.S. and the EU combine forces to expel Russia from their financial systems, like they did with the Russian banks expelled from SWIFT, then Putin's decoupling would be the appropriate defense against such economic weaponization against Russia. So Rutter argues that by sanctioning Russia, ironically, the dolts in D.C. and the bullies in Brussels only further empowered Putin and disempowered the globalist world order. And that's, of course, because prior to the sanctions, Putin created an economic alliance with China that would more than make up for any sanctions imposed on Russia by the West, particularly in relation to Russia's food and fuel exports. China's massive market is more than capable of compensating Russia for any lost trade in its decoupling from the West. And it's not just China. India has now announced that they will be instituting an alternative payment system from both SWIFT and the U.S. dollar when trading with Russia. And this is all as India and China are today meeting together and resolving their geopolitical differences and border disputes. So now we have literally more than 40% of the world's population establishing trade systems that are happening almost completely irrespective of both SWIFT and the U.S. dollar, which is nothing less than the beginning of the dismantling of the liberal globalist system. That is what's really happening here. It's not the nonsense that's getting spewed out by revived neocons on social media. The world order that the neocons themselves helped build is imploding. That's why they're so upset. Now, I should note, Ritter does not think this is the only reason Russia invaded Ukraine. It wasn't just an excuse, a ruse to decouple Russia from the West economically. as I pointed out in my video on the real reason why Putin invaded Ukraine, we have to recognize that these economic sanctions are just insult to injury given NATO's policy of eastward expansion since 1998. NATO had 17 member nations in 1990. Today they have 30 member nations. They've almost doubled in the last 30 years, and Russia sees that as an existential threat. NATO missiles, NATO military bases via Ukrainian membership on Russia's border, they see that as the same as the Cuban Missile Crisis for the United States. And so Putin has, over these last several years, been setting up alternative economic and geopolitical structures that could theoretically operate irrespective of the liberal globalist world order as run by NATO. And with the hostilities in Ukraine, particularly in the Donbass region between Ukrainian forces from Kiev and the breakaway republics who just want their independence, right? Donetsk and Lugansk, somehow they get forgotten in all this. Putin believed it was time to decisively act. And as a result, we are witnessing the end, the dismantling of the globalist world order. The very sanctions that were meant to cripple Russia at the hands of globalist powers are the very means by which those globalist powers are themselves being undone. Now, before you go, you will definitely want to check out my latest video. I just uploaded it this morning on leftists like Bill Maher and Trevor Noah turning on Biden. They're both admitting that Putin would never have done any of this if Trump were still the president. Absolutely fascinating admission. You definitely want to check it out. So make sure to click on the link, and I will see you over there. God bless.